Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 6 June 2025. In preparing my episode on J. Glenn Gray, I read J. Glenn Gray, A Personal Remembrance by Timothy Fuller. This account of Gray's life and thought included an interesting claim in the following passage. Quote, his wartime experience dramatized what is meant to find no satisfaction in the present and to be deprived of the chance to think. Thinking in this sense takes away from the distractions of past and future because, as Arendt liked to say, thinking and acting cannot be combined. Acting in the world imposes on us the concern about where we have been and where we are going in a most immediate and relentless fashion, unquote. I hadn't previously found in Hannah Arendt the idea that thinking and acting can't be combined, so my curiosity was piqued. I've been through the entirety of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann and Jerusalem and On Revolution and Between Past and Future, and I don't recall anything in these books about the mutual exclusion of thinking and acting. And there's no citation for this claim in Fuller's discussion of Gray, so I have no idea where exactly he got this idea. Admittedly, these aren't Arendt's more theoretical works. I've been focused on philosophy of history, and I'm not that familiar with her The Human Condition or The Life of the Mind with the 2 volumes on thinking and willing, which would seem to be the obvious place to start in understanding Arendt's position on the relation of thinking and acting. I suppose I really should read The Life of the Mind through. Interestingly, others have said precisely the opposite about Arendt of what Fuller claimed. For example, the relationship between thinking and acting, a short online reflection available from the Hannah Arendt Center and signed with the initials RB, which could be Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center, includes the following, quote, Arendt follows Heidegger in seeing thinking as the same as acting, unquote. This quote implies the opposite of what Timothy Fuller quote, though there are probably tortuous ways to interpret both so that they agree. Again, as with Fuller, there's no citation to indicate where the author found this idea in Arendt. So which is it? Without tying ourselves in knots, is thinking the same as acting, or is it that thinking and acting can't be combined? Trying to answer this question is, at least for me, compounded by the fact that I know I'm likely to misconstrue Arendt's position. In my episode on Arendt, I said that I have had difficulty following her arguments. I think this is because, in part, Arendt's way of seeing philosophical problems is so different from my own. At least part of this is the influence of Heidegger. I've also said that I don't care for Heidegger, and reading Arendt recently has made me more conscious of the extent to which Heidegger influenced Arendt. Like Glenn Gray, Arendt mostly doesn't use Heideggerian terminology or language, but her thinking is deeply Heideggerian nevertheless, perhaps more so than Gray. And in this way, her works are more useful to me than Heidegger's because I can actually read Arendt where I can't read Heidegger. The Heideggerian nature of her thinking may be one of the factors that makes it difficult for me to follow her meaning. For the same reasons, I can't speak to the claim in the quote that Heidegger asserted the identity of thinking and acting. Heidegger is well known for saying thinking and being are one, which he attributed to Parmenides in his Introduction to Metaphysics, but we'd still require another step to get from being to acting, and I'm not going to attempt that since my interpretation of Heidegger would probably be too wide of the mark to even count as an effort. On the other hand, I think I can offer a respectable interpretation of Arendt, so that I will attempt. In the introduction to her The Life of the Mind, Arendt wrote that it was her book Eichmann and Jerusalem that interested her in the problem of thinking. What distinguished Eichmann and what led to her famous formulation of the banality of evil was Eichmann's thoughtlessness. She wrote, quote, it was this absence of thinking, which is so ordinary an experience in our everyday life, where we have hardly the time, let alone the inclination to stop and think. that awakened my interest, unquote. So Arendt's conception of thinking is immediately bound up with moral ideas of volition, motives, and evil doing, as she calls it. I could call this an essentially ethical conception of thinking, and we could contrast this, for example, to an epistemological way of thinking. Descartes made thinking the basis of certainty with his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But since his was an epistemic motivation, not a moral motivation, the result is effectively a different conception of thinking. There's a sense in which we could call Descartes' conception of thinking narrowly epistemological, but there's another sense in which Descartes has a comprehensive conception of thinking. In his Principles of Philosophy, section 9, Descartes wrote, quote, "By the word thought, I understand all those things which occur in us while we are conscious, insofar as the consciousness of them is in us. And not so only understanding, willing, and imagining, but also sensing are here the same as thinking," unquote. In a taxonomy of thinking, we could say that Descartes is the ultimate lumper who places all human cognition under the category of thinking. Arendt, on the other hand, is a splitter who wants to make finer distinctions among forms of human cognition. For example, she writes, quote, "Thinking, willing, and judging are the three basic mental activities. They cannot be derived from each other, and though they have certain common characteristics, they cannot be reduced to a common denominator," unquote. Can we formulate a taxonomy of thinking? And if we can, how many kinds of thinking should our taxonomy recognize? A taxonomy of thinking that embraces the conceptions of thinking of Descartes and Arendt could be derived from the traditional branches of philosophy: ethics, epistemology, aesthetics, logic, and metaphysics, each of which could correspond to a distinct conception of thinking. In my episode on Glenn Gray, I quoted Gray on a primarily artistic response to things having been replaced by a technological mentality. And we could think of this primarily artistic response to things as an aesthetic conception of thinking. Aristotle, in turn, represents a logical conception of thinking, and we could say that Plato represents a metaphysical conception of thinking. But Arendt builds out her conception of thinking around a core of moral concepts, so I call it an ethical conception of thinking. To get a sense of where this places Arendt among other philosophers, consider what a couple of analytical philosophers have had to say about thinking. Arendt, in her book, The Life of the Mind, is thinking about thinking if she's doing anything. And Antony Flew wrote a book titled Thinking About Thinking, which presumably would have some relevance to what Arendt was doing in writing in The Life of the Mind. But Flew's approach to thinking is almost exclusively logical. He begins thinking about thinking with a discussion of validity, truth, propositions, and argument. He calls this the basic equipment for thinking about thinking, but this wasn't Arendt's basic equipment for thinking about thinking. Arendt had very little to say about logic or validity in The Life of the Mind, but what she does have to say about Aristotle is instructive. Quote, "A close reading of the Organon clearly shows that what we now call logic was by no means originally meant as an instrument of thought, of the inward discourse carried on within the soul, but was designed as the science of correct talking and arguing when we are trying to convince others or give an account of what we state, always starting, as Socrates did, with premises most likely to be agreed on by most men or by most of those generally believed to be the wisest," unquote. I don't agree with the implication here that there's a disjunction between the logical organization of inward thought and the logical organization of outward expression, but I'm going to leave this as it is and move on. One of my go-to reference works is Antony Flew's Dictionary of Philosophy, and in this work, Flew defines thinking as follows, quote, "The mental activity of A, theoretical contemplation directed toward some object with a view to reaching a propositional conclusion, or B, practical deliberation directed towards some object with a view to reaching a decision to act," unquote. Both of these kinds of mental activity that Flew distinguishes involve teleology, or an aim involved in thinking. In the following paragraphs of his definition of thinking, Flew goes on to identify this as the intentionality of thinking, that is to say, that thinking always has an object. Susan Stebbing, in Thinking to Some Purpose, similarly seems to have an exclusively logical conception of thinking in mind, and she also casts thinking in teleological terms. Quote, "To think logically is to think relevantly to the purpose that initiated the thinking. All effective thinking is directed to an end," unquote. But Stebbing eventually takes a surprisingly Fichtean turn and writes a little further on, quote, "We do not think with a part of ourselves. Our thinking involves our whole personality. How I think is conditioned by the kind of person I am, whosoever I may stand for," unquote. Fichte had famously said that, quote, "The kind of philosophy one chooses depends upon the kind of person one is. For a philosophical system is not a lifeless household item one can pick up or put aside as one wishes. Instead, it is animated by the very soul of the person who adopts it," unquote. It's mildly surprising then, but certainly not shocking, that a philosopher like Stebbing, within the analytical tradition and primarily interested in logic, would take this broader view of thinking. And it can provide us with a bridge from the more logical conception of thinking common in analytical philosophy to the morally driven conception of thought we find in Arendt. Arendt might well have agreed with Stebbing that we don't think only with a part of ourselves, but I'll observe that a moral conception of thinking is as narrow in its own way as a logical conception of thinking can be. Stebbing on thinking involving our whole personality is pointing from a logical conception of thinking to a more comprehensive conception of thinking that includes, under its umbrella, logical thought, but also other kinds of thinking, such as ethical thinking. So the bridge from Stebbing to Arendt requires two spans, one from a narrowly logical conception of thinking to a more comprehensive conception of thinking, and a second span from a comprehensive conception of thinking back to a narrowly moral conception of thinking. A narrowly moral conception of thinking and a narrowly logical conception of thinking might converge in a more comprehensive conception of thinking that includes both, but that's not where Arendt starts, and is not where Flew or Stebbing start either. However, we can imagine ourselves having attained to a more comprehensive conception of thinking and equally viewing logical thinking and ethical thinking from this unified perspective. But I started out asking what Arendt understood by thinking, and whether Fuller was right that thinking and acting are mutually exclusive, or whether R.B. was right that thinking and acting are the same thing. So we'll start from what I've called Arendt's ethical conception of thinking, keeping in mind that this narrowly ethical conception of thinking may constitute one taxon within a taxonomy of thought that falls under a more comprehensive conception of thinking. I found a passage in Arendt's Freedom and Politics, a lecture, which is included in her book, Thinking Without a Banister, Essays in Understanding, 1953 to 1975, that explicitly discusses thinking in relation to acting, as well as thinking in relation to producing. But before I get into the Arendt quote itself, since she specifically links thinking and producing in it, I should say something about her conception of producing. Jan Patočka provided a nice clarification of Arendt's distinction between work and production. Quote, "If Hannah Arendt is right that we need to distinguish sharply between work, whose goal is to sustain life and its order, and production, aimed at the lifeless for the purpose of adding to the human world what is hard and permanent, what it needs for support, defense, and attack on the natural environment, then formulae like production of life, production applied to life, are misleading," unquote. This is clearer than anything I could find in Arendt herself. Earlier in the same book, Patočka had written that Arendt, quote, "distinguishes work, production, creation, and action as the grand dimensions of active life," unquote. And in a different context, he elaborates a subtle distinction between labor and work. Quote, Arendt contrasts labor, preventing the extinction and decay of life, which consumes without establishing anything of permanence, with work, which builds a firm, permanent structure of life, shelter, and community, the indispensable places of a home, unquote. Here we can see the preoccupation with Marxism and continental thought, which seeps into thinkers like Patočka and Arendt, who aren't themselves Marxists, but who found themselves doing philosophy in a pervasively Marxist context. Work and labor and production are central conceptions of Marxist thought. They never even appear in the logical conception of thought we find in many analytical philosophers like Flew and Stebbing, but we do find them clustered around Arendt's conception of thinking. Arguably, these concepts rightly belong to a more comprehensive conception of thinking that would include these ideas from economics in addition to ideas from ethics, logic, aesthetics, epistemology, and metaphysics. If this is an accurate way to frame Arendt's conception of thinking, then we could say that Arendt, like Stebbing, was also pointing the way to a more comprehensive conception of thinking by adding economic thinking to moral thinking. But now to the Arendt quote from Freedom and Politics, a Lecture. I'm going to break this paragraph into smaller chunks and then comment on each chunk after reading it. Arendt then says, quote, in contrast to thinking and producing, one can only act with the help of others and in the world. To act in concert, as Burke puts it, realizes the ability to begin as being free. The difference between acting on the one hand and producing and thinking on the other is that in producing and thinking, only the beginning is free. The completion, if it is successful, never realizes more than the thought already grasped at the beginning, or the thing conceived beforehand by the power of the imagination, both of which are subject to the processes of production or thought, unquote. Here she's making the distinction between acting and thinking, as well as producing, that I found in Fuller's essay on Gray. Recall that Patočka said that Arendt takes production to be something like the building of infrastructure, which seems really odd to me to oppose this to acting, since what Patočka called adding to the human world strikes me as a paradigmatic form of action, but leave that aside. For Arendt, acting is essentially communal. While in producing and thinking, we can choose our point of departure, but the task itself imposes on us a kind of teleology, so that having chosen our point of departure, we're boxed in when it comes to the outcome of thinking producing. Arendt goes on to say, quote, by contrast, however little an action may achieve, the performance of it remains directed toward the constantly renewed actualization of freedom, with new beginnings constantly flowing into what was once had begun. For the result of action is not an object which, once it has been conceived, can be produced. The result of action rather has the character of a story, which continues as long as people continue to act, but the end and the result of which nobody, not even the person who began the story, can foresee or conceive, unquote. Action, so long as it continues, is the realization of freedom, and as such, the outcome isn't a self-fulfilling prophecy as with thinking and producing. She says that action has the character of a story, that is to say, action is a narrative, or is part of a narrative, but it is an open-ended narrative in which no one knows the end of the story, and she believes this to be essentially different from thinking and producing. And Arendt continues, quote, in the case of action, the beginning and performance are therefore not so separate that the person who begins to act knows everything in advance, while those who help him complete the action need only realize his knowledge, follow his orders, and execute his decisions. In action, beginning and performance merge into each other, and when applied to politics, this means that the person who takes the initiative and thus starts to lead must always move among those who join in to help him as his peers, and neither as a leader among his servants nor as a master among his apprentices or disciples, unquote. I think I see what Arendt's getting at here, and it's a conception of social action, which we could also call political action, such as we find as the focus of her other works like The Origins of Totalitarianism. But she constructs this conception of social action on what I take to be rather inadequate foundations. For example, there's no reason whatsoever to exclude the possibility of individual action. She said that in action, we act together with others. But we also act on our own. We can still make a distinction between thinking and acting in the individual life and see individual acting as the narrative of the individual life. But Arendt's concern is with social and political action, so this doesn't serve her purposes. But I think we also have reason to question the distinction between thinking and acting, whether individual or collective, as Arendt formulates it. With production, it's fair to say that we begin with a plan, and if we're successful, we complete that plan, so it's not an open-ended process. But with thinking, I don't think this is the case at all. Thinking can be the fulfillment of, as Arendt said, the thing conceived beforehand by the power of imagination. But thinking, no less than action, can be, again, as Arendt said, the constantly renewed actualization of freedom with new beginnings constantly flowing into what has once begun. Certainly for me personally, thinking is always like this. That is to say, it's always a renewed actualization of freedom and always with new beginnings flowing in as I repeatedly interrupt my chain of thought as new and related ideas occur to me. Arendt said, quote, "In contrast to thinking and producing, one can only act with the help of others and in the world," unquote. But what could be more communal? What could be more acting in the world than producing? Almost all our infrastructure, the work of our production, is produced by the large-scale social cooperation, not only of the labor force, but also the planners and the suppliers and the overseers, and ultimately the whole of a society that builds out its infrastructure. So I don't think there's any good reason to make the particular distinction that she's making between thinking and acting. She's subtly redefining action to be something narrower than what action means in ordinary language, essentially plucking out a privileged use of action as exemplary for the concept of actions she wants to employ. But why does she want to feature this particular conception of action? Since her approach to thinking is what I've called an ethical conception, she seems to want her ethical conception of thinking to converge on a particular political result of communal action. And to pull this off, she muddies the water by likening thinking to production, when production is much more like action than thinking, and much more likely to be communal than either thinking or acting. But Arendt hasn't been the only one to subordinate philosophical thinking to a political program. Jürgen Habermas, in his Post-Metaphysical Thinking, presents an historical sketch of the emergence of post-metaphysical thinking from a mainstream tradition of metaphysical thinking and philosophy that was shattered, as he says, mostly by the scientific revolution and its consequences. In this book, Habermas takes on what he calls the redemptive significance of the contemplative life, which he also calls the strong conception of theory. According to the strong conception of theory, quote, "Theory itself is affected by being embedded in an exemplary form of life. For a few, it offers a privileged access to truth, while for the many, that the path to theoretical knowledge remains closed," unquote. I largely agree with Habermas' sketch of history, but not with the implications that he draws from it. Habermas assimilates theoretical thinking to elitism and social privilege. And certainly we can find historical examples of theoretical thinking conferring elite status and social privilege. But the history of philosophy is at least as often a history of outsiders, slaves like Epictetus, the obscure like Vico, the marginalized like Spinoza, and the neglected like Hume during his lifetime, unlike today where he is among the most read of English language philosophers. In any case, the paragraph from Arendt that I've discussed does seem to bear out Fuller's contention that in Arendt, thinking and acting can't be combined. If there is another sense in which, like Heidegger's Parmenides, thinking and being are one, and this then somehow translates into the identity of thinking and acting, then this sense must find a place within the framework Arendt constructed for herself for understanding thinking. Still, although I disagree with Arendt on almost everything, and I think her account of thinking as an attempt to frame a political program as an analysis of thinking, there's value yet that can be extracted from this inquiry. The idea of a taxonomy of thinking, for example, has some merit. It could help us to distinguish conceptions of thinking, all called thinking, but approaching thinking from distinctively different perspectives, such as, for example, a logical perspective or an ethical perspective. And a taxonomy of thought, in its turn, could illuminate an inquiry into thinking as it manifests itself in altered states of consciousness. In my episode on Glenn Gray, I said that we haven't come to grips with the fact that much of human history is made by individuals experiencing altered states of consciousness, especially in war and religion, which have disproportionately shaped human history and civilization. I realized after producing my episode on Jan Patočka that Patočka can be understood as attempting to come to grips with altered states of consciousness represented in war. In the last of his 6 heretical essays on the philosophy of history, Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War, he focused on the orgiastic forces unleashed in war and cites Junger in this connection. But I think we have to push this further. And one way to push this analysis further would be through an inquiry into thinking as it manifests itself across various altered states of consciousness. I don't think that the conception of thinking I've reviewed from Arendt, Flew, and Stebbing, or any others, are yet equal to this task. Not only that, the taxonomy I suggested earlier of conceptions of thinking corresponding to the traditional branches of philosophical inquiry doesn't seem to be adequate to the task either. I think it's a good starting point to develop the idea of distinct conceptions of thinking, if only as a device to categorize what philosophers have said about thinking. Well, we probably need to go considerably farther than this, and we probably need to dig it considerably deeper. I could argue that an inquiry into thinking as manifested in altered states of consciousness ought rightly to be a psychological inquiry, and perhaps even it belongs to psychopathology, but I don't think this does justice to the problem. There's a genuine cognitive element in many altered states of consciousness that can't be dismissed as mere craziness or the epiphenomenal excrescence of a mind blowing off steam. We need to do justice to this cognitive element in thinking, however deranged the thinking may become. Suppose we postulate that the thinking manifested in altered states of consciousness, however unhinged it may seem, is in each case an altered form of thinking as manifested in the ordinary business of life. If we accept this postulate, then it would follow that the altered states of consciousness that I've referenced in relation to war and religion, which have played such a prominent role in shaping history, would be extensions of a couple of the conceptions of ordinary thinking that have been identified but transformed, perhaps intensified and modified by an extreme form of consciousness. In chapter 4, the soldier's relations to death in Glenn Gray's The Warriors, in which he mentioned altered states of consciousness in passing, he formulated a disjunction between those who participate in communal ecstasy and those who become automatons in combat. When I read this quote in my episode on Gray, I didn't draw any attention to the distinction implicit in the passage, so now I'm going to read it again. Quote, "In mortal danger, numerous soldiers enter into a dazed condition in which all sharpness of consciousness is lost. When in this state, they can be caught up into the fire of communal ecstasy and forget about death by losing their individuality, or they can function like cells in a military organism, doing what is expected of them because it has become automatic. It is astonishing how much of the business of warfare can be carried on by men who act as automatons, behaving almost as mechanically as the machines they operate," unquote. Communal ecstasy and automatonism are two distinct altered states of consciousness, and it's not clear whether or not these two altered states of consciousness have their origin in the same category of ordinary thinking. To pursue this line of thought would involve finding some form of continuity between the taxa of ordinary thinking and the taxa of thinking during altered states of consciousness, establishing a one-to-one correspondence between them. And this would mean finding some essential property that is expressed in both ordinary and altered states of consciousness, and which property is distinct from that of other taxa of thinking. But we don't have to insist that there's no overlap or intersection among categories of thinking. Especially in regard to thinking in the context of altered states of consciousness, originally separate categories of thinking may become intermingled and confused. I don't think the altered state of consciousness of the soldier in combat or the religious worshiper experiencing an ecstatic epiphany are either of them pure forms of thought, though in a simplified model of thinking, our idealization of the conditions of thought would tend to produce an idealization of thought in altered states of consciousness. There's also the problem of the identification of apparently different forms of thought that are in reality the same, or contrariwise, apparently identical forms of thought that are in reality distinct. For example, some would argue that religious thinking is a form of ethical thought, but I don't think this is the case, and I'm not alone in this. F.H. Bradley, in his Ethical Studies, cited Matthew Arnold's definition of religion as morality touched by emotion, and then immediately attacked the idea. Quote, "Most emotions, high or low, can go with and touch morality. And the moment we leave our phrase-making and begin to reflect, we see that what is meant is that morality touched by religious motion is religious," unquote. Nothing has been gained here because the definition is circular. The problem of what forms of thinking are identical and what forms of thinking are distinct points to the more fundamental question of how many forms of thinking we need to recognize. In addition to logical, moral, aesthetical, epistemological, and metaphysical conceptions of thinking, what other conceptions are there? Or what other conceptions ought there to be in order to provide an adequate overview of human thinking? When I was discussing Arendt's view of thinking, I suggested it was an admixture of ethical and economic thinking, and that adds the category of economic thinking to our taxonomy. But Arendt also makes an important point that should be observed in any adequate taxonomy. I quoted her earlier as writing, quote, "Thinking, willing, and judging are the three basic mental activities. They cannot be derived from each other, and though they have certain common characteristics, they cannot be reduced to a common denominator," unquote. A taxonomy should be reduced to as few basic categories as possible, but no fewer. Paradoxically, determining what's conceptually simple is one of the most difficult conceptual tasks that there is. But we need to try to determine what's conceptually simple, and what can be derived from the conceptually simple and therefore falls under that category, in the present context, a category of thinking. Are thinking, willing, and judging all conceptually simple and therefore must be distinguished? What about other cognitive processes? I mentioned earlier pragmatic or instrumental thinking, which I also compared with how engineers think. And I think we can identify these ways of thinking with the technological mentality that Gray, following Heidegger, understood as distinctive of our time. In the age of industrialized warfare, it's this technological or instrumental category of thinking that's probably what's involved in combat. In my episode on Marc Bloch, I quoted Bloch that the fall of France to German forces in 1940 that he described in Strange Defeat was in part an intellectual triumph. That is to say, it was a triumph of thinking. The Germans had mastered the new technological mentality in war in the way that the French had not. But Strange Defeat was written in the aftermath when there was time for reflection. How did this technological mentality manifest itself in the heat of combat? Peter Paret, in his 2009 book, The Cognitive Challenge of War, Prussia 1806, writes, "New weapons," quote, "new weapons or methods often appear in highly charged situations which affect the response to them," unquote. And Paret also noted, quote, "The employment of violence can be rational, and yet violence and its effects are always emotional and subject to the irrational, even when the violent act is justified as it may be in self-defense," unquote. The emotionality and irrationality of military operations means that the apparent procedural rationality of technological thinking gets pushed beyond its limits and reappears in an altered form in the context of an altered state of consciousness. So it's entirely possible that the kind of technological thinking that's appropriate to combat today in the age of industrialized warfare, and which under stress of combat can be transformed into the red cloud that Ernst Jünger described, or into the automatonism that Gray described, that these forms of thinking can be combined with action. Well, the kind of thinking that's involved in the examples cited by Arendt, and which are focused on by her ethical conception of thinking, may not be able to be combined with action. So there's the possibility there that different principles of relationships between thinking and acting hold for different categories of thinking. In cases like these that I've been discussing, that is to say, in cases like combat, I think it would be silly to insist that thinking and acting can't be combined, as I examined in relation to Arendt, since in this frame of mind, thinking and acting are as fully integral as anywhere in life. This was made explicit in John Boyd's formulation of the OODA decision loop, which is a sequence of observation, orientation, decision, and action, with the imperative being the contraction of your own OODA loop until your OODA process is shorter than that of the enemy, and you preempt the enemy's own OODA loop. Again, this is a reflective statement of a process that looks rather different in its implementation under extreme circumstances. But combat isn't the only history-making activity that involves a distinctive category of thinking that's transformed into something else in extremis. If religious distinction is as distinctive as F.H. Bradley suggested in the quote that I gave earlier from him, then that's another category of thinking. And while religious thinking may be distinct today from instrumental thinking, that wasn't necessarily always the case. That is to say, categories of thinking may shift over time. We can at least entertain the possibility that when the Crusaders went into battle, they did so in a religious frame of mind that could be called religious thinking, or that when Pope Julius II strapped on his armor and led a papal army to increase the domains of the papal states, he was engaged in some admixture of religious, political, and military thinking. In my newsletters, I often discuss formal thinking, and formal thinking can be divided into logical and mathematical thinking, and mathematical thinking can be further subdivided into geometrical and arithmetical thinking. So should we recognize a distinct taxon of formal thinking in addition to the other categories of thinking I've considered so far? And of course, there is, not to be left out, historical thinking and historical action. Last year, I produced an episode titled How to Think Historically About the Future, which implies that there's an historical mode of thinking or historical category of thinking, presumably sufficiently distinct from other categories of thinking that it should be named as such. So even though this episode hasn't been narrowly focused on the philosophy of history, we can see that the philosophical problem of thinking is relevant to a philosophy of history and could serve to elucidate a historical category of thinking. That's what I have to say at the moment about Arendt's conception of thinking and the claim that thinking and acting can't be combined. I don't find myself in agreement with Arendt, but I've tried to outline some ways that we might pursue a taxonomy of thinking that might shed some light on the problems with which she was engaged. And a listener suggested that I include a bibliography. So in the description of this episode, I've appended a bibliography. I won't do this for every episode, but I'll do it when I have the time and the inclination. So thanks for listening.